I met someone the other day who had met the Dalai Lama and worked with him a little bit. And she said how everybody who meets him is so respectful and so deferential for him. And I thought, wow, that sounds good. And maybe it's his title, the Dalai Lama. Maybe if I was the Dalai Baba, that might help. We're talking about creativity. And I thought maybe a person's life, we could use a person's life and study it to develop our concept of creativity. And so I want to tell you about this man. He was born in a small town in Minnesota, and his parents were very much academics. His mother was a science teacher, but there wasn't a lot of love and sharing in the family. When he went to bed at night, rather than hugging his mother or kissing her, they shook hands, literally. His father got elected to Congress, and their careers were so important, and so he went back and forth between Washington, D.C. and this Little Falls, Minnesota all the time. By the time he graduated from high school, he had gone to 11 different schools and virtually did nothing in any of them. So much so that later in his life, reporters went back to Little Falls, Minnesota to ask people for anecdotes about this guy's life. Nobody could think of anything, good or bad, that he did. And his parents had controlled his life, and even though he didn't really like school, they decided he was going to be an engineer, got enrolled in University of Wisconsin, got through his freshman year basically because his mother wrote his papers for him. By his sophomore year, he had decided he wanted his own life. He was going to do what he wanted to do and was going to determine his own life, and he wanted to become a pilot. He wanted to go into aeronautics. And so he just flunked out of school. He left, found a small flight school. This was back in the 20s. There weren't a lot of airplanes and flying in the United States. There was more in Europe. They had actual airlines and things, but they didn't in the United States. He found a small flight school, and it was in the plains where you could get two people, one in front of the other. But his parents wouldn't support him. He didn't have much money. So he rode with the pilot, but to actually get experience flying it, you had to put bond money for the plane in case it crashed, and he didn't have that. So he never actually got to pilot it, but he decided, this is what I'm going to be. His focus was very strong, and so he became what was called a barnstormer. They flew around for the entertainment of people, and within a couple of weeks he was walking on the wings of planes. He parachuted out for the crowds, even though nobody ever taught him how. But it was kind of a wild time. At one point he tried to take off down the main street of a very small town, clipped a pole, smashed into the plate glass window of a hardware store. He and everybody else survived. He crashed several times. He finally was able to go to a flight school. He got enough money, but there really still wasn't anything for pilots to do. He started flying for the Postal Service. And that was really good training because they didn't put very much into that. You landed in fields. There were no kinds of even searchlights out for direction. You had to find your own way, make sure everything worked for you. So this was his life, and he was doing what he wanted, but he wanted more. He said, I am going to be the top pilot in the world. And the top pilot in the world in 1920s was to fly across the Atlantic Ocean nonstop because nobody had ever done it. He had no resources. He went to St. Louis where he knew some businessmen. He got 9 businessmen to put in money. And he said, look, this will be great publicity for St. Louis. We'll put your name on it. The Spirit of St. Louis. He got $13,000 from him. He was going to buy this plane that was really good, and it had flown several good flights, but the person said, I'll only sell it to you if I can name who's going to be the pilot, because I want to make sure there's a good experienced pilot, and he wouldn't do that. So he found this small company in California. For $6,000, they would build the plane for him, plus the cost of the engine. In 2 months, they built this plane, designed it because they had a design, but it wouldn't fly across the Atlantic, so they were redesigning and building at the same time. What he didn't realize was they were able to commit all of that to him because they were on the verge of bankruptcy, and he was their only client. So he has them building this plane, and one of the big issues was they had to put in a larger fuel tank to fly across the Atlantic. There are very few gas stations for airplanes when you're flying across the Atlantic in the 1920s. Only they didn't know how far it was from New York to Paris. And so they literally went to the library with a piece of string and took a globe and put it across there to measure the distance from New York to Paris, and that's how they determined the size of the tank. And he didn't have a lot of money for this, and he didn't want a lot of weight, so he didn't have them put a gas gauge in. He said, if I'm flying across the Atlantic and I see I'm low on gas, what good's that going to do me? So he gets this done. He flies to New York. There's only one field there that's big enough for the planes to take off. He's got this single-person plane. He's never been known as this great pilot. There are 2 other teams waiting to fly, but the weather's gone bad. Both of them have the big dual planes. They have life rafts. They have several weeks of food on them. They've got mechanics. They've got help. They're spending about $500,000 for each team on this. A French team had just tried to fly over again, one of the large planes, well, the supplies, and they had died. Probably close to a dozen people had already died trying to fly across the Atlantic. He had this small plane. His supplies, he said, I'm not bringing life raft, I'm not bringing flares, anything, I'm bringing some sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. He's flying by himself. He's got these pedals and the gear stick between his legs. To read the map, he had to hold it there. The flight was about 36 hours. At night, he had to put a little flashlight in his mouth so he could be reading the maps as he flew. The weather broke. He took off, as you all know. Charles Lindbergh was the first one to fly across the Atlantic. When he got to Paris, his thoughts were, oh my gosh, I wonder if anybody's going to speak English. Will I even be able to find a place to stay? Will I get arrested because I don't have a passport? Well, of course, they had telegraphed across and there were 100,000 people waiting for him. He became literally the most famous person in the world at that time. Everywhere he went, huge crowds. And so we can look at that and say, you know what? We have the ability to create what we want in life. And yet, our belief system comes from religious science, and as scientists, as spiritual scientists, we can't take it on that level. We're required to look at it more deeply for something. And so when we look at his life more deeply, did this man have the creative ability to create the exact life he wanted? Well, I think many of you know he did this. He became famous. He hated crowds. And it just drove him nuts. And many of you know their young son was kidnapped and killed. he and his wife became so despondent that it was just the news. Everybody wanted it. Everybody wanted to know every detail. They moved to Europe and went into seclusion, in effect, for many, many years. He spent most of his time doing kind of flying consulting and would go all over, and typically only spent a few months a year with his family and with his children and raising his children. And years after he died, it came out that he actually had 3 families in Europe, several mistresses who had children, and he told them, he convinced them, do not tell your children who their father is. Mm-hmm. It wasn't an ideal life. I mean, this man did one of the most spectacular feats in the world, and yet that creative power was not able to create this perfect life for him. Why is that? Now, I admit that I have this sort of affliction, I have this defect in me. I know we very much like emotions and we like intuition, and I have this affliction where I think about things. I think about all sorts of things. I think about when Gina and I walk our dog, why does he stop every few feet and sniff? There's nothing there. And when you think about these things and you study them, you find that dogs' sense of smell is between 1,000 and 10,000 times better than a human being. So there are things there that she's smelling all of the time. I think about when we meet somebody, why do we say, how do you do? And shouldn't we answer, how do I do what? But if you think about this and you study it, you find that what we used to say is, how do you? And do had a different meaning. Do had the meaning of your health. How do you feel? It was a phrase that meant, how do you feel, in effect? And we kept the phrase, we changed the syntax a little, we kept the phrase, but we changed the meaning. I think about, why is the speed of light, 186,000 miles a second, the fastest that anything can go? And that would take way too long to explain, so I'm not going to talk about that. But I think about these things. And then I think about spiritual creative power, the greatest power in the universe. Why do we use it to create material things for us? I studied religion quite a bit. I certainly wouldn't claim to know all of it. Read a lot about the Buddha. I don't remember anything where he said, I'm the awakened one. I'm the enlightened one. I could merge my soul with the universe and be in nirvana at this time. But out of my compassion for my followers, I'm staying to make sure that you understand how to use the spiritual power to get yourself bigger houses. I'm tired of all of you living in this small huts. I don't remember that. I've read all of the Gospels. I've read the Gnostic Gospels. Read lots of quotations about Jesus, I don't remember one where he said, I'm going to die horribly on the cross for you, but it's just okay to do that for me. I feel good about it as long as my disciples know how to use spiritual power to get more money and get better clothes. I'm tired of my disciples